I will.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Julian, for the wonderful introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this series. And I'm glad all of you are able to join us today. I look forward to the Q&A. I have the most fun. I love giving talks. I love talking about research and everything, and I also love just sort of talking with people. So I look forward to the back and forth and Q&A with all of you. I will not be able to also look at the chat while we're going, but feel free if you pop stuff in the chat. When I finish, I'll take a quick look and then we can sort of engage from there. So yeah, so the talk today is about techno-social engineering, and it builds on a whole series of, oh, my slides are not advancing then. There we go. A couple of different books that I've, Re-Engineering Humanity, and some other stuff that I've been working on, and have since, that was published back in 2018, but some other things that I've been working on since then. And I'll try to mention some of those things as we go forward. But what I want to start with is just a couple of personal stories. So talking about techno-social engineering is often, I should even back up for a second. The one way to think about this project, the way Evan and I, we spent 10 years working on this project, on this book and associated research. And I see it as almost like there's a bunch of puzzle pieces that haven't really been put together. Like there's lots of concerns about different kinds of digital technology and privacy and security, in whether it's in the schools or in your cities or in your home or personal devices. There's lots of little puzzle pieces that were sort of, each one is interesting and stands alone. And in the book, we sort of put them together in a way that it gets complicated, and I think one useful way to get into the story is with a bunch of like simple examples that you may be familiar with, that kind of hopefully resonate and kind of illustrate some of the deeper ideas that are sort of developed in sort of incredible detail in the book and other work. So I want to start with a personal story. So a few years ago, my kid, my first grader, came home from school and he was super excited. And he's like, hey, dad, guess what? I won. I got picked. I get a new watch. And it looked something like the thing on the screen. And, so I respond, that's great, buddy. Like, what happened? And he rattles off something about being one of the kids in his class who was selected to wear a new watch for gym class. Right. And so 2 days later, I receive a letter in the mail. I realize this is way too much text to ever put on a screen. So don't really, don't worry too much about like digging through it. But I wanted to show you the actual letter we received. My reaction to this letter was, I would say, atypical in my community. Basically, when I read the letter, I went ballistic, right? So I wondered about a variety of privacy issues up front, right? So the who, what, where, when, and why with regard to the collection, sharing, use, and storage of data about kids, right? The letter doesn't even vaguely suggest that parents or their kids could opt out, much less that, consent in one form or another would be required. So I read the letter again and again, and I got stuck on this particular line, which I'll highlight for you. Let's see if this comes through. There we go. Okay, so I got stuck on this line over and over again. I don't know if you get stuck on it, if you're, this bugs you, but bath time and bedtime surveillance didn't sit right. So I contacted someone at the PTA, and I met with the supervisor of health. I wrote a letter to the superintendent. I met with the general counsel of the school district. And I think what caught people's attention most was a line from a letter I sent in a very lawyerly sort of tone, and I'll quote it. I have serious concerns that about this program and worry that the school district hasn't fully considered the implication of its child surveillance program. Well, no one had called it child surveillance before. And so the creepiness of bedtime and bath time surveillance apparently sunk in. Using that term generated a visceral reaction. And so it was an effective means for getting people to stop and think. But I have to say, no one seems to have done so for a number of reasons, right? The program is like many adopted by school districts across the country. It's well-intentioned, it's aimed at a real problem, combating obesity and a lack of fitness. It's financed in an age of incredibly limited and shrinking budgets. It's elevated by the promise that accompanies all new technologies. And frankly, people trust the school district and they love technology, right? So after my intervention, I hate to admit it, but little changed. Apparently better disclosure and informed consent would fix everything. But in my view, this only shows why conventional privacy concerns fall woefully short. Right? The most pernicious aspect of this program was not the 24/7 data collection, nor was it the lack of informed consent. Now, to be clear, these are real problems. I'm not saying otherwise. I just finished earlier today teaching a law, economics, and technology of privacy class. I care deeply about the privacy issues. But the deeper concern I had with the program is the unexamined techno-social engineering of children. It appears no one thought about how the program shapes the beliefs and preferences of a generation of children and their parents to accept without question or concern a 24/7 wearable surveillance device that collects and reports data to others. Now, I don't know, if you think about it, I could pause for a second, we might ask, like, does this feel or sound familiar to you? Can you think of other examples where this type of conditioning operates in the background, taken for granted as if it were just natural or inevitable, when in fact, it's not? We'll talk about some other examples in just a second. So in things like this, you should expect something called creep. In computer science, it's called function creep. In surveillance studies, we call it surveillance creep. And in our book, we talk about boilerplate creep and nudge creep and a whole bunch of other phenomena that take the same form. But let's just stick with surveillance for a second. Surveillance creep can take many forms, and it's worth paying attention to. It can be the gradual expansion of surveillance from one context to another. So, for example, from the classroom to the home. Or surveillance creep can be the gradual expansion in the types of data that are collected in a particular context, for example, in this classroom, or again, in the home. Or it could be the gradual expansion in the use of data, or the third party with whom data is shared. And frankly, it could be any combination of all of the above, right? Usually, surveillance creep is something that you think about happening on the side of those who are doing the surveillance. So you might think the NSA or Amazon, right? They're creeping surveillance through different technologies. But it also happens on the other side, as those who are being surveilled become accustomed to it, as their beliefs and preferences about surveillance technology are shaped through their experience. So the school program, the Activity Watch program, normalizes an arrangement that occurs in non-educational contexts too, right? So insurance companies want customers to provide self-tracking data so they can set rates. In the employment sector, these kinds of programs are becoming increasingly pervasive. Now, perhaps my concerns might seem a little too dystopic and even speculative. I mean, do we really need to worry so much? I mean, in re-engineering humanity, what my co-author Evan Selinger and I do is he's a philosopher. So we use hypotheticals or thought experiments so that we can examine the path we're on, right? And so it can help us think critically about how what we do today might shape the future that we're presenting for ourselves or for the next generation. So we imagine, right? Suppose a school district were to extend the range of sensors on the Activity Watch, right? So it can collect data about mental fitness or attentiveness or even mood or emotional states. It's kind of sad to say that when we wrote the book in 2018, this was hypothetical. It was speculative, and people dismissed us. They poo-pooed us for being too dystopian. That would never happen, but it did. This is just one example. You can look at lots of other examples. We should expect that technology to creep, and we were only too close to touching on the kinds of technologies that are in fact already creeping into the classrooms. But let's just hope that shocks delivered. This is an actual technology, by the way. Let's just hope that shocks delivered to nudge us to behave according to script don't become normalized in our schools, workplaces, or really anywhere else. Now look, fitness tracking in schools is just one example. And I tell you, there's many, many more. So let me tell you another personal story. And it's just, before I do that, actually, before I jump into the story, let me tell you a personal fact. Julian, I don't know how you arranged this fortuitously, but today happens to be my birthday. So this is kind of, it works well with the story, I guess. What do you all say? I can see Julian sort of mouthing it, perhaps. I don't want to hear it. It's okay.
Happy birthday, but I guess that's why you didn't shave. You wanted to look older.
That's right. That's right. So what do you say? Well, thank you very much for the well wishes. And let me jump into my little story. So a few years ago, I don't know if you guys have, any of you have had this experience, but my email inbox flooded with Facebook notifications, right? It was basically indicating that a bunch of friends had wished me happy birthday. This makes some people happy, I guess. I was annoyed because I had to deal with clear my inbox. So I logged in and changed the birth date in Facebook to a random date midsummer. Facebook doesn't need to know my birthday, I thought. And like Homer Simpson, 6 months later, my email inbox flooded again. I felt so foolish. But at first, I didn't think much of it, right? So I was like, most Facebook friends don't actually know my birthday. They responded automatically to the script, this prompt, the same way they would if in person I'd said to them, hey, guess what? It's my birthday today. Just like Julian and maybe many of you did as well. Today's not actually my birthday. Sorry, just a little social engineering humor. No worries.
I figured that was too much. That was too much of a lead-in because I'm familiar with that paper of yours.
You know my paper, right? Because we actually ran a study after this based on that anecdote. Thank you for playing along, though, Julian. But it is just social engineering humor. It works well with a live audience. But look, the point is, you have no reason to know my birthday. You don't know me that well, right? But I have to say that 2 messages that were sent by my close relatives caught my attention. My brother and sister-in-law, they know my real birthday. We celebrate together because my brother's birthday is a couple of days after mine. My real one, that is. So their automatic responses resembled all the rest. Happy birthday, Brett! ! And for me, this raised an important question, right? Why didn't they recognize the fake birthday notification? Like, why didn't they stop and think about the veracity of the signal? Is there behavior evidence of stimulus response programming? And if so, does it matter? Is it significant that automation bias trumped human judgment in this instant? Is it just a single mistake, or is it indicative of something perhaps more lasting or even broader in scope? Now, I ended up running an experiment. I published an article a few years later, this is after the book and stuff, where we ran a study with fake birthday notifications, and it turns out on the fake birthday, it was a statistically indistinguishable number of responses in comparison with the prior 2 birthdays, and strong ties still replied, and there's some indication of the kind of programming that we'd hypothesized in the earlier work. But let me keep going. Can you think of any situations in your own life where automation bias trumped your human? Oh, I have missed the slide, sorry. Yeah, we were supposed to be on that slide. But anyway, can you think of any instances where automation biases trumps your human judgment, right? So one that often jumps to mind is when you automatically follow the instructions given by your GPS, like even when you've got that nagging feeling that maybe you should stop and think for yourself. Maybe this isn't the fastest route. Maybe there's something there's another reason why I'm going this way. Perhaps you've seen this episode of The Office. Where Michael Scott drives into the lake because he was told to. Let's consider another example that I bet is familiar to everyone in the audience, and that's an electronic contract. So we have a whole chapter in the book and some subsequent work that sort of explores electronic contracting. So how many written contracts, have you entered into in your lifetime? Or even just the past year or the past month? I have to say, if I'd asked this question in the past, like a couple decades ago, the answer would be an order, if not orders of magnitude less than the answer provided today. And here's the kicker. In the near future, people may find the question odd, right? It won't make sense because the very idea of distinct identifiable contracts may be at odds with the experience of completely seamless contractual governance. I think this raises a really interesting theoretical and moral issue. freedom of contract requires the correlative freedom from contract. When contract becomes automatic and ubiquitous, as it often is online, for example, both disappear. There is no freedom. And so, have you ever clicked I agree and accepted the terms of service for an online contract you didn't bother reading? Well, of course you have. We all have. These contracts are, more importantly, as we explore in the book and elsewhere, the human-computer interface through which they're presented are designed so that there's no point in reading the fine print, much less in stopping and thinking about the legal relationship you're forming, or whether the third parties that are lurking in the background are trustworthy. Now, it's a simple user experience. See it, click it, perfectly rational stimulus response by design. What's really interesting about the example is how the click-to-contract interface has sort of migrated or crept across contexts. From websites to mobile apps to the smart TV in your living room, and virtually every other supposedly smart device you'll soon see as the Internet of Things and smart cities and everything else arrive. Now, bear in mind that the context, the legal relationships, the data exchange, and so on are dramatically different across these different contexts. And yet the engineered stimulus response more or less remains the same. I think our online contracting regime is a pretty compelling example of how our legal rules coupled with a technological environment can lead us to behave like simple, predictable, and programmable machines. And yet it's far from the only example. Have you ever been in a social situation where you shouldn't check your phone, but you just can't help yourself? There's nothing worse than a family member, a friend, or a colleague sits down for a meal and they plop their smartphone on the table. It changes the nature of conversation, of interaction, of social interaction. Then there's social media, right? Ever find yourself habitually using superficial expressions promoted by the interfaces, clicking a like or a retweet or a heart button instead of formulating a thoughtful response? We all have, to the extent that we're social media users. Social media platforms are optimized to get users to communicate this way, because the platforms profit from a style of communication, which in Orwellian doublespeak is called engagement. Now, social media platforms aren't fully responsible for fake news or misinformation problems or disinformation problems, but they do play a significant role. And part of the reason why is that the platforms are designed to discourage critical thinking, deliberation, or just leaving the platform. For example, to fact check or do something else. I mean, they encourage people to outsource thinking and nudge people to remain always on. What do I mean by always on? How are you nudged to be always on? Well, we can run a simple experiment. I won't be able to actually see your reactions at home, but you can do this. If you've got your smartphone, pull it out. Go to the settings and turn off geolocation services or tracking. If you don't know how to do this, wow, we got to talk another time. You should know how to do this, but if you don't, that's okay. Go into the settings and look under privacy. If you've on an iPhone, you'll find location services and turn it off, and you get a screen that looks like this, right? Okay, so now what I'd like you to do with your experiment is to turn it on. Turn on geolocation or turn on location services. What do you have to do? What does the screen look like now? Well, to turn on tracking, you simply touch a button. That's it. Notice the green, I have a screenshot of this. Notice the green colored button. What does the green color suggest to you? Go, it's safe, right? All right, so now let's turn it off. Let's turn location services off. And note what you have to do and what does the screen look like now? Well, okay, turn off tracking. A person touches a button, receives a warning message, text that itself is a pain to read, and then must touch the red turn off text to confirm one's decision. Now, of course, this isn't the same on all phones. You might not be seeing this, but if you are, even if you're not, you can see it through the screen online. This still exists on my phone, for example. Can you see the difference? This is what we call the asymmetrical use of friction by design, right? It's an unambiguous data-driven design steers users towards the engineered path of least resistance, which is always on geolocation tracking. Okay, so there's friction in the direction of privacy, and there's no frictionless slide into tracking. Not only in the incremental decision, but also in terms of the lasting effects as you interact with the interface over time. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but now at least you'll see it. Be on the lookout for it, right? These and many other examples reveal how powerful techno-social engineering is occurring everywhere. In fact, I would claim, again, I'm behind on the slides, techno-social engineering exists on an unprecedented scale and scope, and it's only growing more pervasive as we embed network sensors in our public and private spaces, our devices, our clothing, and even ourselves. It reconfigures many of our lived-in environments, from our workplaces to the home. And one scenario that's frankly worth considering is that the smart tech of the future will program us to behave automatically and to perform scripts that algorithms supply. It's a simple extension of the click-to-contract script. Now, of course, I'm not the first, nor will I be the last to invoke Orwell or dystopian sci-fi. I mean, I hope you've all seen Black Mirror. Now, Black Mirror resonates, right? For a reason. I mean, in many science fiction stories, humans unwittingly sow the seeds of their own destruction by madly rushing down a technological path attracted by the siren's call of efficiency, optimization, and perfection, only to learn too late that along the way they've lost something, their humanity. So I once wrote this, I wrote this a few years ago. I'll put it on the screen, there we go, for John Scalzi's blog. So John Scalzi is a science fiction author, and I wanted to summarize the big ideas in my nonfiction book, Re-Engineering Humanity, and the fiction novel, Shepherd's Drone. So human beings, and I often open up talks with this in a different kind of talk, but human beings have special powers, right? We can imagine things that don't exist and communicate with each other about those things, right? In person, at a distance, and across time. These basic powers allow us to develop shared culture, beliefs, laws, technologies, and other things that are essential to cooperation in modern civilization. And what matters, I would argue most, is how we exercise these powers across generations to shape our world and ourselves. And this is how we engineer humanity. So the big idea permeating these books and some of my other work is the contingent nature of humanity and our freedoms in worlds increasingly governed by technology. So how can we put some of the pieces together? Let me try to put some of the pieces together. Oop, slides again. No, okay. So I missed one, which is the slide I thought I'd shown. The idea is the freedom that we experience in terms of meaningful agency or degrees of freedom in our lives is not naturally given or inevitable, it's contingent. Okay, so how do we let's put some of the pieces together. How can we understand our current moment, the social dilemmas we face collectively, and the possibilities for the future of humanity? So here's an old story that helps to tell the tale. So you might recall the Cambridge Analytica story from a few years back, right? So the firm obtained private information from millions of Facebook users, and it offered tools that allegedly could identify the personalities of voters and influence their behavior, right? Now, regardless of the effectiveness of their purported tool, right? There's a temptation to focus on Cambridge Analytica as an exceptional bad actor, right? But this is a mistake, I would argue. There are thousands and thousands of similarly situated companies leveraging the Facebook and other social media platforms to collect data and use it to develop intelligence, actionable intelligence, right? Now that might lead one to diagnose the problem as a Facebook or social media problem, right? But again, that would also be a mistake because Facebook is just one of many just one of many big tech companies, right? So we could talk about Google or Amazon or eBay or any number of large companies. But again, I would argue an exclusive focus on big tech or regulating big tech or fixing big tech is also a mistake. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of smaller tech companies too, all pursuing the same basic objectives, marching us down the same path. Digital network technologies are re-engineering our planet, our social systems, and our very selves. And so we need to think, I would argue, at a different scale and a different way. What we really should be talking about is the world we're building for ourselves, our children, and future generations, and to examine the interconnected global and intergenerational considerations, and at the same time, relate them to consideration of our everyday lives. The best, though admittedly imperfect metaphor, is climate change. So bear with me for just a second, right? So here I will give you one admittedly simplified way to understand climate change. We want energy. Energy is essential to our modern activities. We can build different supply systems for energy that we need, but the one we've relied on for over a century is heavily dependent upon burning fossil fuels. It need not be, but fossil fuels have been relatively cheap, convenient, and politically supported for past and current generations. And as a result, massive external costs are pushed on to future generations. Now, blame could be cast on big fossil fuel companies, but we all bear responsibility too. We all make countless individually and incrementally cost-benefit justified decisions advantaged by cheap and convenient fossil fuel consumption. It's a massive global intergenerational tragedy of the commons. Dealing with climate change is politically and economically difficult precisely because it requires significant structural change, interventions at the macro, meso, and micro scales, and frankly, adjustments in how we live our lives. The digital network, and I've simplified a bit, but you get the point, hopefully, the digital networked environment suffers from a similar type of tragedy. We want to connect, communicate, interact, transact, and otherwise engage with each other nearly instantly. Digital network technology, like energy, seems an essential input into so many of our modern daily activities. After all, every day we each make various decisions about digital technology that seem on their own terms rational and unproblematic, right? We adopt technology, mindlessly bind ourselves to terms and conditions offered. We follow scripts written and paths set by platform designers. We carry, wear, and attach devices to ourselves and our children, maintaining a connection and increasing our dependence. We outsource thinking of all sorts because, heck, there's always an app for that. It makes it convenient. Each decision may be cost-benefit justified, yet the net effect on who we are and the lives we're capable of leading may be unjustifiable. So climate change may threaten our planet. Always on techno-social engineering threatens our humanity. Now, I bet again, maybe skipping. I always forget about the slides. I'm in the middle of the talk. Again, you might be wondering what I mean when I talk about humanity. And this is something we go into at length in the book. I realize for time purposes that I want to get to the Q&A. I don't want to go on about this for too long. So I'll skip it. Happy to come back to it in Q&A, other than to say that there's a distinction between being human and what matters about being human. Being humans, what meaningfully distinguishes Homo sapiens from other species. And again, it's those capacities, those powers I mentioned before. And what matters about being human is how we exercise such powers over and across generations to collectively produce and sustain normative conceptions of humanity. Reflected in the infrastructures we build, the human rights treaties we commit ourselves to, the legal institutions, the social and moral fabric and framework of society. And it's often our commitment to the basic capabilities for human flourishing, reason, common sense, free will, agency, and sociality that are at risk. So across generations, human civilizations have answered these questions, right? sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but one way or the other, we've answered these questions through our world building and thereby have developed and sustained shared normative conceptions of what matters about being human. This is the humanity I am been talking about. This is the humanity I would suggest is potentially at risk of destruction. Okay, so as I said, I can talk more about what I mean by humanity if people are interested. I can talk more about these questions and what they lead to. Let me sort of jump to wrap up, as I promised Julian I would, with a brief note on some of the strategies. So we talk about a bunch of strategies in the book, and I've been working on some other projects that develop strategies for resistance and strategies for overcoming techno-social engineering, which is the title of the talk. So let me talk about just a few and do it pretty quickly. So I advocate for resistance and change on multiple levels. For again, as I noted earlier, I framed the dilemma, humanity's techno-social dilemma, in terms comparable to climate change. So a few of them. One critical strategy is to resist pressure to engineer a friction-free world where transaction costs are eliminated. In economics and engineering, friction is often understood as an obstacle to be overcome or a cost to be minimized and even eliminated if possible. But frictionless transactions, though, the case being that frictionless transactions promise greater efficiency. Seamless interconnection promises greater scale and larger networks. And so you might think there's a number of design mantras that flow from some of the economic and political logics that drive societal progress. And so the design mantras will be familiar to anyone in law, economics, and engineering. So I'll just state a few of them, right? So digital network technologies and corresponding techno-social systems ought to maximize efficiency, minimize transaction costs, eliminate friction, seamlessly interconnect, increase speed, scale, and scope of engineered or technologically mediated interactions, and democratize whatever. Literally fill in the blank after democratize, whatever you like. It could be democratize commerce, democratize culture, democratize innovation, knowledge, news, speech, right? And the idea is that we ought to maximize efficiency, minimize transaction costs, do all of the things, democratize any of those things. Those are the design principles we ought to aim for. The problem is each of the mantras is superficially defensible, but deeply flawed if you examine them further. They're not just wrong, they often mislead and obscure important social, political, and economic issues and trade-offs. Right, so human beings are necessary, and I won't go into this for too much, but human beings are necessarily inefficient. We need friction in our lives. Seams are critical to governance. We need boundaries for ourselves and our communities. Interconnection often should be seam full, as that friction provides opportunity or space for governance. Growth in scale and scope are often overrated, as they can have substantial hidden trade-offs, usually involving externalities. Democratize, like the word innovation, has become a useless buzzword that hides considerations of power, quality, and meaning, among many other things. And so what are the kinds of strategies I would suggest that I've been working on more lately, sort of building off some of the stuff in Re-Engineering Humanity? One of them focuses on engineering, is focused on something called friction in design. So we want to engineer friction into techno-social systems so that we can slow down, stop and think, interact meaningfully, practice and develop capabilities essential to human flourishing. So one interesting story that kind of, I think, helps crystallize, for me at least, some of the trade-offs is, and it leads to the second point about critically questioning tech boosterism, is a few years ago in Scientific American, Pedro Domingos, a leading AI expert, published an article called Our Digital Doubles. And among other things, he envisioned a digital double going on millions of virtual dates and living countless probable lives so that it could deliver to you, the consumer, the optimal romantic partner and life. No more bad or mediocre dates. What do you think out there? Does that make you happy or what? For him, this was an incredible innovation. But I tell you, for me, it was emblematic of our dilemma. Because life and romance are not problems fully comprehensible in the language of computation. What if the costs of going on some bad dates are what allow you to learn something about yourself and others? How will you know what you want? How will you know how to author your own life if you haven't had any experiences that include the good, the bad, and the ugly? So we've got to critically question vacuous tech boosterism in all its forms, this being just one of them. That's one of the things. Engineering friction is the other. Here are some recent papers. These are actually papers that are all works in progress currently for me, all focusing on friction, different proposals for friction in design. So there's friction in design regulation. Generally, there's a paper dealing with governance seams, which are thinking about the boundaries, borders, and interfaces where friction plays a role in enabling governance. You can think about the architecture of a home and the intervention of the smart home, which seamlessly interconnects school and home, and sort of you might want to think about what the governance seam ought to be. And we could think about some others. And then there's another one on friction in design, how friction in design on social media systems and others sort of ends up moderating or amplifying or dictating speech. And you can think of it as being analogous to the asymmetric use of friction in design in the iPhone example for privacy that I discussed with you earlier. So the example is to sort of work through and think about how friction in the design of systems steers people in different directions. And so how we might regulate friction design to enable people the opportunity to govern for themselves. So how am I doing on time? And I don't see a clock, but I'm probably at the time where I should turn it over to you. So basic line is wake up, everyone. Here we go. If I had the music, I'd cue it, but I don't. But this is my last slide. This is my re-engineering and Rage Against the Machine. The story behind this is my son, the one from the story at the very beginning, the Activity Watch story. When I told him about the book, he said, "Dad, you titled it terrible. It should have been Re-Engineering Humanity. The title of your book should have been Wake Up." This is like his favorite song, so I thought I'd end with that. All right, I'll stop sharing and open it up.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can also blame Rage Against the Machine for having George W. Bush as president, because they were campaigning for Nader actively, which I'm sure he basically got George Bush elected, which is ironic. So you can be well-intentioned and, of course, irresponsible at the same time, which is, of course, typical of teenage rebellion. Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you so much for all of that food for thought. I just want to ask you a couple questions here, and then I'll open up to other people I'm sure have questions. I see that one of my co-authors has jumped on, Christian Merzith, who's working on that paper I mentioned, on nudging with me. And so this is really interesting. So you see this in many ways as a tragedy of the commons problem. And so you're doing a lot of work on this sort of issue of this strategy of restoring the notion of the commons with respect to information in smart cities, right? And from a point of view of Elinor Ostrom's work, informed by Ostrom's way of thinking. So that's a really fascinating way of thinking about it. You can think of course, the last business ethics speaker series we had was with Victor Pickard, who's also really concerned about, I guess what you might call it is in your terms, over democratization of the media. So I guess what we have here, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that every little individual who's making their own tech decisions for themselves ends up creating massive externalities. Does that make sense? Or is it that each of the apps, each of the products, technological instruments that we're using is the individual that's in a collective sense ultimately creating that tragedy, or is it both?
Well, so it's a metaphor. So it's like if analytically, if you use the tragedy of the commons story, the way we do it, the knowledge commons and other work that I do, is you got to spend some time identifying the relevant resource that's shared, and then talk about the governance mechanisms and the kind of social dilemmas that arise from you also have to identify who the community is. that shares it, and then the kind of the social dilemmas that arise. So in the context of humanity's techno-social dilemma, I would say that humanity itself is the shared resource at risk of tragic deterioration or depletion. And humanity being the set of shared commitments and ideals that we intergenerationally commit to. Different groups and communities commit, and they vary because we adopt sort of a pluralistic approach to what those values might be. So different things may be at risk in different cultures or different groups or different countries, for example. And that's okay. That would fit with the theory fine. The thing that causes the tragedy or the depletion is the perfectly rational decisions of those, all of us as members of societies who share that resource and use it and build on it, is we make decisions regarding technologies, digital network technologies, smart technologies, a whole bunch of different technologies, that on their own terms, just like a sheep herder making a decision to add a sheep to his flock or her flock, right, is perfectly rational, and that incremental cost benefit kind of trade-off sense, and it doesn't account for the social cost, the impacts on the shared resource, or the impacts on others, the external effects. And it gets a little bit more complicated because for each of us making these decisions, we're not only imposing social or external costs on others, on third parties and other people, but also on ourselves. And so there's external effects between like my present, my present self and my future self, or who I am and who I want to be, right? So if I lose the ability to author my own life because I'm increasingly outsourcing those kinds of things, and I lose the capability to deliberate and think for myself about and exercise my agency and my autonomy, the harm is also to just myself, my future self, or the self I want to be. So it gets a little bit more complicated than just the straight up tragedy of the commons, but it's the structure that is
because then we all become instruments of our own enslavement.
Yeah.
So one last question for me. So if you were going to suggest one or two things that might be efficient, I mean, Jonathan Haidt is struggling with many of these same questions, and so there's always this temptation to come up with very relatively easy short-term fixes without even getting into the long-term fixes. The first challenge I see fundamentally, though, philosophically, is why should people care? You ask people, well, they're losing their humanity. It sounds really lofty. Like, what is the real reason why I should care? What do you mean lose my humanity? That's very meta. But then if you're trying to pinpoint a way in which this humanity could be restored or at least protected from an organizational point of view. I mean, one thing we could have done, of course, is not release ChatGPT onto the populace just because it's good for the company. We might have actually thought about researching it a little bit more. But I mean, short of those types of obviously irresponsible choices, if you ask me, is there something that we could do if we were designing some of these apps in a way that if we wanted to restore or at least protect people's, I guess, good habits?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two-part answer. The one I'll just do real quick, but then I'll try to be more specific. The first part is the part of the reason about making the humanity techno-social dilemma claim about it being a broad, multi-level, complex, wicked problem is that just like in climate change, there's 100 different institutional solutions, interventions, things we need to do, and in fact can do to deal with climate change, any one of which standing alone won't do it. And I think that a similar response is important to bear in mind for humanity's techno-social dilemma. There's no panaceas or even easy, simple fixes. And it's not just like one, just like in this paper I'm writing right now on friction in design regulation, we explain that like privacy, content moderation, antitrust are all perhaps necessary but insufficient forms of governance through regulation that are important, but they're not independently. Each one of them is not going to be enough because they don't address some of the root causes. And so the paper so this gets me to the second part answer to your question is I think one of the things designers can do, both private companies doing the design and also there can be public regulation sort of inducing this kind of design is to think carefully about the basic design imperatives or design mantras of seamlessness and frictionlessness, and ask yourself, when actually injecting a little friction into your system, yeah, it might slow things down or seem inconvenient. And yes, people don't want it right now. Like they hate cookie pop-ups and they hate, any kind of thing that slows down the process of getting to the content. But that desire and that want that people currently have is an engineered one. Like the preferences we have for instantaneous satisfaction by reaching the satiating content we find online is not a natural or inevitable or necessary one. It's shaped by our interaction with platforms that are designed to give us dopamine kicks from the certain kinds of interactions.
Right. So that's yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say. So I think thinking about how to inject, friction with a purpose into some of the interfaces and designs of the technology we interact with on a regular basis is one, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve it, but it's one kind of thing we can be doing.
So you would, of course, as you said earlier, want to replace that value of the seamless experience with a seamful experience of technology.
Yep. I think seamful experiences and also seamful governance. A lot of times you erode seams to provide a seamless experience because it makes everything seem interconnected, and it's beneficial from an experience standpoint, but it also erodes boundaries between things that might actually have meaning.
Beautiful. All right, Christian, go ahead. Let me unmute you. Actually, it looks like there. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you, and apologies for showing up late. This is daylight savings confusion.
I didn't even notice.
I think this point about friction is really powerful. So first, a question for you: have you been thinking about the issue of friction in education, the sector we're sort of all in? I'm sort of observing that higher education is becoming problematically frictionless for many of our students. They no longer, as I was discussing with Julian the other day, students don't know how to go to the library and find a book anymore. You're supposed to have a link, active link on the syllabus, immediately accessible. But maybe even more serious than that, what about childhood? I'm not a father myself, but I'm an uncle. And I'm worried that childhood is becoming extremely frictionless. So are we programming people or conditioning people for this hedonistic instant gratification through frictionless childhood?
I think the answer is yes, and I think it's because this is why it's a systems problem. But yes, I mean, I think the in education, I think there is a increasing pressure to provide instantaneous feedback or to provide access to materials or resources as quickly and conveniently as possible, as if there's no additional benefit associated with the labor of searching and finding or working your way through to get to the content. And I think that's one of the areas where it's certainly this idea of the seamless and frictionless kind of design imperatives have deleterious impacts.
Yeah, the upside is that as educators, we might have some control over this.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of there's a couple little things that pop into mind. I don't know, this is kind of they're smaller points, but they're like there's a thing I do in one of my classes where I talk about this book with my students, and I have them do a little assignment. I say, for a week, don't put your smartphone in your bedroom. I said, how many of you sleep in the bed at night? And almost everybody sleeps with their phone in the bedroom. I said, try a week without it. and reflect on what it's like. Like, how has having the smartphone in your bedroom patterned your behavior? And how, when you don't have it, do you recognize the pattern and start to wonder whether or not, the friction of having it in a different room means I have to go, if I want to check the time or I want to use it as an alarm clock, there's some friction. But on the other hand, I sleep more peacefully, right? And there's a bunch in the reflections you get from students, if given the chance to encounter the friction and then reflect on why it's meaningful or why it might matter, and that there's a choice between two different ways of being. And at the end of the day, we usually do we talk about it, and some of the students go back to the behavior. I like the phone in my room, but a good number of them say, you know what, I bought an alarm clock and that works to wake me up, and so I keep the phone in the charger downstairs.
That's
and this
amazing.
Reminds me of a study that a woman in the nursing school had done on this topic, and there were adolescents in college who were sleep texting. They would like sleepwalking, but they're sleep texting. They're getting on their phones and texting and stuff. And part of the behavior is associated with the when they were in the home, the rules their parents had, like whether or not the parent had a rule that you had to put the phone in the charger downstairs. Then the students who had that rule in their home were just sort of used to it, and so when they got to college, they wouldn't sleep with it on them or near them, and so their behavior was different. And so it sort of suggests your point about childhood and friction in childhood. Sometimes the rules that you have to follow as a kid in a home seem like just pure friction, but there often, one would hope, is a reason or a purpose or a learning objective associated with it. That's where your culture, your values often come from.
All right, so since we got started 5 minutes late a little bit with introductions and things, I figured we could just add 5 more minutes. So does anybody else have a burning question here for Brett?
I would like to ask what your thoughts are in terms of the legality of AI using pieces of existing art or existing writing to create AI art and AI writing.
On the legality of it?
Yeah, in a sense of plagiarism, because it's been very confusing to me, and I've seen arguments where there should be an argument that these sort of programs should be illegal because they are sampling from work done by people.
Yeah, so there's the straight copyright law question, right? Which I'm not sure if you're familiar with copyright law and stuff, but the copyright law question is there's a couple, but it's whether the use being made of the copyrighted work is deemed to be an intermediate use by the person using the AI system, such that it's intermediate copying that would qualify as a kind of fair use. And this goes back to sort of the Google Books. There's a series of cases in the Google Books sort of litigation that deal with that kind of fair use. And that remains, as I understand it. I haven't followed the latest cases, so I may be a little off on this, and so this is not legal advice to anybody. My recollection is that it's still an open question with the AI training, training on copyrighted materials, whether it constitutes an intermediate copying that would qualify as a kind of fair use. But I think that's kind of where the legal arguments will be, is around there. There's also ethical, moral, and other kinds of questions that, apart from whether copyright law would deem it to be fair use and thus not infringing, or consider it to be a form of infringement, there also may be other governance questions about whether or not it is plagiarism is not the same thing as copyright infringement. So it still might be a form of plagiarism and thus be unethical because it doesn't credit the sources. And then there's also questions about how you might evaluate the practice in terms of how it improves or pollutes, depending on, you could debate this. I don't have a position at the outset. Improves or dilutes the information environment itself, right? So whether LLMs trained on copyrighted works that generate new kinds of art generate the kinds of improvements that themselves copyright, like, so apart from whether it's infringing or not, there's a question of whether they are then copyrightable or not, and then who would get copyrights. There's a whole bunch of interesting, it is a
Right,
hot topic.
So right now, I think the version 4 of ChatGPT just came out, and it can work with imagery as well as text.
Yeah.
So I guess Sean's question more had to do with whether or not that would be fair use. I think it would have to be fair use. I mean, if you took a Picasso and mixed it with a Matisse, and made something new like that, that would be fair use, right?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Those two examples, yes, because the examples are in the public domain and not under copyright. But if I took
see.
two currently copyrighted works and just mixed
Oh.
them to create a third work that was creative because of the way I mixed it, doesn't necessarily constitute fair use. It could be transformative. There's a kind of fair use that's transformation of the original is a factor, but it's not a dispositive factor in fair use analysis in the copyright. So just
Basically, your answer is it's complicated, and we
Yes.
have to yet to sort this out.
Yeah, you gotta be careful because just because your intuition's about what is creative doesn't mean it's fair use or not, right? One way or the other, or it's transformative wouldn't necessarily make it fair use.
Wow. Okay. Well, that you just even more complicated, even more.
Thank you.
So, unfortunately, that looks like all the time we have for today. But I just let you present, and you went a bit over just because I was really enjoying the presentation. And at the end of the day, this is really about us learning from you. So thank you so much for that. You really covered a tremendous amount of ground. And I just want to remind everybody that this will be posted on the main website for the business school here at Metro Denver. And it should be up in a day or two. So you can always come back and check it out there. And other people can as well. So I just want to thank you so much for this and for the time, and happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
And
yeah, sorry I went a little over, everybody. You guys, if you have questions that you want to ever follow up, just don't hesitate. You can email me or something and get in contact. That's cool.
Thank you very much.
Yep, you're welcome.
all right, bye-bye.
Bye.